Welcome back to Philosophy for Flourishing, the show where we explore principles and practices for living the happiest, most fulfilling life possible. In a previous episode, I had a discussion with Robert Begley and Carrie Ann Biondi about Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics and why it makes sense for those of us who want to flourish today to go back to this ancient work for guidance. And now I'd like to kick off this project in earnest. So let's start with a reminder about what this series of episodes is and is not. I'm going to relay and comment on what I take to be the most enlightening and useful ideas in the Nicomachean Ethics. But I'm not an Aristotle scholar, and I'm not going to attempt to relay every major, never mind minor point that Aristotle makes. Just the ones that clearly benefit the project of this show, which is helping us to build an operating system for flourishing. So I commend those of you who want to explore every nook and cranny of this very important book, but for that I'd have to recommend reading it in full in the context of a college course with a good professor, if you can do that. But what you'll get here, in effect, is the greatest hits of the Nicomachean Ethics as selected by yours truly. So with that disclaimer, let's dive in. By the way, I should also say here that I'm primarily using the Joe Sachs translation published by Focus Philosophical Library, and I'll post a link to that edition in the show notes. Also, occasionally when I have a question about a passage, I'll compare it to the Cambridge University Press edition translated and edited by Roger Crisp, but that's not often. One of the biggest topics in Book 1, and perhaps one of Aristotle's great insights, relates to the hierarchical nature of means-end relationships. So if we look out at the world, we see people engaged in all sorts of activities. Some are taking classes in anatomy and physiology, some are building machines, some are cooking dinner, some are recording music, making love, recording podcasts. And yes, of course, they had podcasts and machines and all this stuff in ancient Greece. No, but I'll use contemporary examples as often as I can because it really helps me to better connect the ideas to modern life and to using them today. And I think it'll be helpful for you too. So if we look at these cases, the anatomy and physiology student, the person building machines, the person cooking dinner, so on, it's just obvious that people perform these activities as a means to some other end. So the anatomy student perhaps is taking that class so that he can get a degree, maybe a degree in medicine. Maybe he wants a degree in medicine so that he can go on to become a surgeon. And maybe he wants to become a surgeon so that he can save lives and support his own life. So there's very clearly a means to an end here, or a whole chain of means to ends. And likewise, if we look at the people that are building machines, let's say diesel engines, also very clearly a means to an end. Why do people build these engines? They don't just do it because they want to. Engines like this power such things as big rig trucks. So let's say we're talking about somebody who's building engines for big rig trucks. Why do we need these trucks? Well, we need them so we can move heavy equipment and large loads of goods from one place to another. Let's just take groceries, for instance. So why do we distribute groceries? Well, the farmers can't eat everything they produce. They've got to get it to market where they can trade it for money that they can then use to buy their things that they need, and others want it to come to market so that they can buy it and eat well. So here we see these chains of means-end relationships. Some things are done for the sake of others. If we didn't need surgery to save lives, we wouldn't do it. And if we didn't need to get groceries and things from one place to another, if we could just snap our fingers and it was done, we wouldn't bother building the big rig trucks or the engines required to power them. So in some sense, these ends are higher than the means that we use to get them. They are more aimed at. They are the values that we're most interested in attaining. Now, some of the other examples I gave, this is less obviously the case, if it is at all. Recording music and making love, for instance, seem to be in a different category, right? In all likelihood, a musician makes and records music because he enjoys it. He might also make money from it, but what he's primarily aiming at, or let's just stipulate that this is so for the musician in our example, is this certain enjoyable experience of making music. What he aims at is the experience. The purpose of the process is the process itself. And this is even more purely and clearly true in the case of making love. We might call it an end in itself. But even here, if we step back, there appears to be a larger purpose of enjoyment and pleasure in life. And what Aristotle is getting at is that in every activity, there is some end that is aimed at, and that there are hierarchies of these ends. We make the metal so that we can craft the engine, so that we can build the truck, so that we can deliver the goods, so on and so forth. And if we step back from all of these means ends chains, all of these individual hierarchies of means to ends, we can see that they're all like puzzle pieces in a much larger hierarchy. We can see that they're all subservient to a larger, higher goal, to the thing most aimed at, which is living a good life. As we talked about before, Aristotle calls this the eudaimon life. What we're after is eudaimonia. And as Carrie Ann pointed out, this is often translated as happiness, but that doesn't quite capture it because happiness is an emotional state and emotions can fluctuate pretty wildly. They are derivative, emotions are derivative of certain facts about how our lives are going. And eudaimonia is it's not the emotional state itself, but the facts upon the basis of which we would say that our lives are going well. So it's a cause, and happiness is a typical effect, but they're not the same thing. I'm opting to use the English word flourishing for eudaimonia because it's an apt translation, and it's one we're already familiar with, this show being, of course, Philosophy for Flourishing. Now, people have all these varying opinions on what flourishing and happiness are. They do today, they did in Aristotle's time, and Aristotle addresses a handful of these and shows why they're inadequate. There are those we call hedonists who believe that physical pleasure is the basis of happiness. Aristotle is going to say that we definitely need to experience pleasure in life, but if that's all we're after in life, we're never going to achieve a flourishing life. We're never going to achieve eudaimonia. And I like to think of Jabba the Hutt from Star Wars here. He's this big sort of slug-like alien crime lord who surrounds himself with slave girls that bring him food and the like, and his life is basically about getting pleasure. Now, we introduce some complicating factors with that example. So instead of thinking about Jabba the Hutt, just think about in your own life. If all you ever did was chase pleasure from food, sex, drugs, rock and roll, and you were to go on Facebook or something and see that your friend from high school had just launched this cool, innovative company, you would quickly realize that there's something missing in your life of endless pleasure. Even if you could continue going on doing that, suddenly that pleasure wouldn't be all that pleasurable. Pleasure is not the thing most aimed at, Aristotle says. It's not the thing at the top of this hierarchy of means and relationships. We're not doing all of these things just so that we can experience pleasure. Pleasure is not irrelevant to the good life, though. So let's suppose on the other end of the spectrum that you're this upright person. You're this morally virtuous, very good person. And you always do the right thing. And a lot of people thought in Aristotle's time, as some people probably still do today, that virtue is the thing most aimed at, that a life of virtue is the thing most aimed at. But you can be virtuous and still suffer terrible misfortunes. Accidents happen. So for me, I'm a guitar player, and making music is one of my all-time favorite things to do. Suppose I were perfectly virtuous, but I were to lose an arm in an accident and I couldn't play anymore. Now, I could be the most upstanding man in the world, but no one is going to look at my life as the ideal of the good life in that scenario. No, my life would have been marred by misfortune. So the thing most aimed at, the thing that makes the good life, is not virtue alone, just as it's not pleasure alone. Aristotle deals with several of these ideas, several of these competing theories of the good life. These are the most interesting, I think, the most applicable still today. Aristotle next gives us a tentative sketch of his own view, and he promises to fill in the details later. Now, we've already seen that every activity has a certain end, a certain thing aimed at. Likewise, Aristotle says, things have specific functions. They do certain kinds of work, and we say that they're excellent if they do that work well. So a leaf, for instance, has a function. Chlorophyll in the leaf absorbs light energy and through photosynthesis produces food for the plant. A good leaf is one that does this work well. And by the way, if the plant is a gardenia or a hydrangea or a rose, we know that it's flourishing because it flowers. This is where the word flourishing comes from, coming into full bloom or the like. All things that exist, says Aristotle, appear to have a given natural function. And being good or excellent consists in performing that function well. So to define human flourishing, we need to know if man has a function, and if so, what that is. Now, a good eye is good because it performs a certain function well, seeing. It does a certain type of work, ergon in the Greek. And we know that carpenters and sculptors and CEOs all perform certain functions. But is there a broader function applicable to mankind in general? If man does have a function, it must be something unique to man. So what could that be? It can't be something relating to the unconscious processes of our organs, because as we've seen, even entities so different from us as plants have these nutritive processes that determine what it is to be good for a plant. Nor can human flourishing overlap with capacities we share with animals, such as using our bodies to be great hunter-gatherers. What sets man apart from all other living organisms, indeed from everything else that exists, is that he has this capacity to reason and be reasoned with. His unique function, the work that he alone can engage in, is to use this reasoning capacity. Aristotle uses the term soul a lot, and by that he means something like the thing that differentiates living from dead, so the thing that makes us alive. And he says the work of a human being is a being at work of the soul in accordance with reason or not without reason. He also says, we set down that the work of a human being is a certain sort of life, while this life consists of a being at work of the soul and actions that go along with reason, and it belongs to a man of serious stature to do these things well and beautifully. End quote. And I just want to add a further explanation from the philosopher J.O. Urmson in his book Aristotle's Ethics, which I'll also link to in the show notes. He says, as a biologist, Aristotle had come to the conclusion that nature is purposive. We can, he thinks, inquire into the function of the heart, the liver, the kidneys, or the eye, and expect to find an answer. None of these organs are mere useless superfluities. But while man, in common with all other animals, has a heart, kidneys, liver, eyes, and the like, he alone has the capacity to reason. This distinguishing feature cannot be a mere useless superfluity either. It is what makes a person distinctively human, and so the fully human life must include it. End quote. Aristotle also says that we have to think of this project of living in accordance with reason as a long-term project, because we don't just live for a short period of time, a few days, a week, a month, like some animals do. We typically live for decades. So when we're thinking about living in accordance with reason, we need to be thinking about a complete life. Aristotle famously said, "For one swallow does not make a spring, nor one day. And in the same way, one day or a short time does not make a person blessed or happy," or blessed and happy, he says. So to recap, Aristotle points out that all these activities we regularly engage in are means to ends, and that these chains of means-ends relationships all aim at a broader, higher goal of living a worthwhile life. And then he looks at the characteristic nature of man, the thing that differentiates him from all other beings, his reasoning capacity, and then sketching his view of the good life, says that such a life must be lived in accordance with reason. Now, with respect to the first, how often do you find yourself doing something, and this often happens in the case of work that is assigned to you, where you think that you vaguely know why you're doing what you're doing, but you're not really sure? There's this humorous example in the first episode of that new Marvel show, WandaVision, that Thomas and I discussed on a previous episode, where Vision goes to work at Computational Services Incorporated, and he asks his coworker Norm, "Would you be so good as to tell me what it is we do here exactly? Do we make something?" And Norm says, "No." "Do we buy or sell something?" "No and no." "Then what is the purpose of this company?" And Norm says, "All I know is since you've gotten here, productivity has gone up 300%. "Yes," Vision asks, "but what is it we're producing?" "Computational forms," is the answer. I know I've been at companies where I've had similar head-scratching moments, and I've also run up against this question in my personal life. I recently cleared some land in my backyard, and I wanted to do it in part in order to reduce the likelihood that we'd have issues with ticks, because my wife has Lyme disease, ticks carry Lyme, they're terrible, wanted to get rid of them. So I got ready to go do it, and I realized before I got very far that I was wearing shorts and a short sleeve shirt. Now, what sense does it make, if my goal is to reduce ticks, to increase my chances of getting bit by a tick in the process? None at all. So I went and changed. And of course, we do this sort of thing without thinking about Aristotle all the time. But it can be hugely clarifying to step back periodically and just to think about the various means-ends relationships in our own lives, and then to reevaluate whether or not we're choosing the right means for our ends, and ultimately, whether all of these are adding up to a life worth living. So I invite you to think about these ideas, to think about how you might apply them in your own life, specifically in building your own operating system for flourishing. And I'd love to hear from you. It's john@theobjectivestandard.com. Love to hear your questions, comments, conversation on this topic. And of course, if you're enjoying the show, I hope you'll subscribe and give us a rating. It's small, but it actually really does help. Until next time, all the best in achieving eudaimonia.